At the height of the Islamic Golden Age, amid the grandeur of palaces and the echo of scholarly debate in the streets of Baghdad, one man towered over all others in intellect and prestige: Abu Hamid Muhammad Al-Ghazali. Hailed as the proof of Islam, he stood at the pinnacle of theological and philosophical mastery. Appointed to the most prestigious academic post at the Nizamiya College, Al-Ghazali was envied and revered alike. Every word he spoke was weighed by jurists, emulated by students, and praised by powerful viziers. He was a man whose name alone carried authority across the Muslim world. But deep beneath the weight of his reputation, a silent unraveling had begun. In the midst of delivering lectures, Al-Ghazali would sometimes fall silent. His voice faltered, his confidence eroded, his pen hesitated. The clarity with which he had once commanded religious and philosophical discourse began to cloud. What started as physical symptoms, a tightening of the throat, a loss of speech, soon revealed deeper spiritual fractures. He questioned not only the legitimacy of his teachings but the authenticity of his own soul. The applause of the masses became a hollow noise in his ears. A man once fluent in every branch of Islamic jurisprudence and adept in Aristotelian logic began to confront a far more difficult subject: himself. He could answer the toughest metaphysical riddles, but not the one gnawing at his heart: was he sincere, or merely a performer in an academic theater? He found no peace in prestige. Surrounded by accolades, he was internally adrift. The more he sought clarity through intellectual rigor, the more obscured the truth became. The conflict was no longer between schools of thought, but between the mask of knowledge and the thirst for genuine understanding. It was not loss of status or opposition that prompted his departure, it was despair. Not a despair of emotion, but one of existential dissonance. Al-Ghazali reached a breaking point where continuing to teach without inner conviction felt like a betrayal of the very religion he was meant to serve. He left not in disgrace, but in silence, abandoning his high station, wealth, and family. What the world saw was retreat, what he pursued was purification. This departure was not calculated or performative. It was sudden, almost jarring to those who knew him. The great professor who once silenced opponents with eloquence walked away without announcement or ceremony. No scrolls, no arguments, only a man carrying uncertainty as his sole companion. In that moment, his collapse was not physical, it was the collapse of illusion, of mastery without meaning. He would no longer cling to borrowed certainty. The disease that afflicted him wasn't of the body but of the soul, doubt so profound it dismantled every construct he had trusted. He doubted the efficacy of words, the sincerity of ritual, the virtue of status. To many, doubt implies weakness. But in Al-Ghazali's case, it was the first sign of strength, the willingness to confront questions others dare not ask. For someone who had written and lectured extensively, silence became the most honest answer he could offer. In this silence, he discovered that knowledge alone was not sufficient. Knowing the legal rulings of prayer was not the same as knowing why one prays. Reciting names of God did not mean he knew God. Beneath layers of theological abstraction, he saw the rot of pride, the subtle intoxication of ego, the danger of public reverence. The same system that trained him to dissect ideas had failed to nurture the heart. What he sought was no longer academic victory, but nearness to the divine, without intermediaries, without pretense. This was not a spiritual epiphany born in comfort but one forged in crisis. His journey into doubt, painful and involuntary, marked the beginning of a far greater journey toward authenticity. Al-Ghazali was not abandoning scholarship, but purging it of its impurities. The collapse others mourned was, for him, liberation. By walking away from the highest pulpit in the Islamic world, he began a pilgrimage not toward physical destinations, but toward metaphysical truth. There was no grand theory guiding his exit. It was not a philosophical stand, but an act of self-rescue. In the vacuum left behind, others speculated, scholars debated, critics whispered. But Al-Ghazali did not look back. He entered a phase of radical self-honesty, where the trappings of his old life no longer had a hold. If knowledge was to mean anything, it had to start with the purification of the knower. Without this, All argumentation was vanity, all eloquence deception. The man once trusted to interpret the divine law now questioned whether he had ever truly lived it. It is here, in this fracture, not in his books, that the real story of Al-Ghazali begins. Not with certainties proclaimed, but with illusions surrendered. Not in the applause of students, but in the sobering realization that no amount of intellect could substitute for a heart that seeks its Lord without deception. This collapse was not a fall from grace. It was a fall into grace. Al-Ghazali disappeared from public life with no farewell, leaving behind his professorship, his admirers, and his prestige. What began as a retreat soon transformed into an ascetic path marked by obscurity and silence. He wandered without the armor of scholarly status. There was no entourage, no platform, no audience. What he carried instead was a wounded sincerity, a burden of doubt that he could no longer suppress with words or accolades. In Damascus, he took residence in the Umayyad Mosque. There, surrounded by architecture he once admired intellectually, he now used the space for quiet reflection. He avoided recognition, shunned debate, and engaged in prolonged periods of seclusion. His days were consumed not by writing or teaching, but by practicing, prayer, fasting, reflection. This was not spiritual theater. It was deliberate abandonment of performance. He cleaned his soul with the same discipline once reserved for refining arguments. For nearly a decade, he passed through cities not as a scholar, but as a seeker. Jerusalem, Mecca, Medina, each place added a layer of humility. He did not collect spiritual experiences to recount later. He submitted himself to each moment, not seeking vision or miracle, but stripping away the layers of intellectual pride that once veiled his inner vision. He no longer wanted to conquer knowledge. He wanted to be conquered by truth. The turning point came not from a revelation, but from persistence. He learned that transformation is not a sudden event, but a slow surrender. In solitude, his ego was starved, his thoughts exposed. For a man trained in syllogisms and dialectics, the shift was radical. Certainty could not be forced through logic. It had to emerge through alignment between the inner self and the divine. This realization was not born from books, but from his internal labor, a process of dying to everything false. His critique of himself grew sharper than his critique of philosophers. He saw in his past a blindness concealed by mastery. He had once believed that mastery of jurisprudence or theology could grant nearness to God. But now he recognized that such knowledge, without purification of the heart, was dangerous. It could mislead others while leaving the scholar untouched by the very truths he preached. It was not enough to speak about sincerity. He had to become it. His embrace of Sufism was not a leap into emotionalism. It was a response to an existential failure. Sufism, to him, was not about mystical states, but about ethical discipline and self-transformation. He did not romanticize it. He practiced it. That practice required honesty about his own failings, his attraction to fame, his subtle pride, his reliance on reason divorced from love. His years in retreat were an act of war, not against others, but against himself. As time passed, a new clarity began to form. Not the clarity of arguments won, but the clarity of motives purified. He discovered that knowledge becomes light only when it serves the heart, not the ego. The heart, once neglected in his scholarly years, became the central terrain of his journey. It had to be softened, protected from vanity, constantly polished. Every act, even silent worship, was now measured not by its external form but by its sincerity. He kept his insights private. He wrote nothing of substance during this period. He refused to document what he had not yet fully lived. This restraint was a sign of integrity. He no longer rushed to conclusions. He allowed the slow grinding of spiritual discipline to shape his intellect anew. His intellect was not discarded but humbled. It became a servant rather than a master. Eventually, he recognized the need to return, not to reclaim status, but to fulfill responsibility. Withdrawal had refined him, but Islam was not a religion of monks. The truth he found could not remain hidden forever. Still, he would return on different terms, no longer seeking affirmation or approval. He would serve, but without compromise. His teaching, when it resumed, would emerge not from argument, but from lived experience. The transformation he underwent was irreversible. He had not merely changed opinions or adopted a different method. He had undergone a reconstruction of the self. His previous identity as a legal master, theological expert, and philosophical critic had dissolved. What emerged was a man who understood that the soul is not purified through logic, nor is the heart softened through rhetoric. He had become someone who could distinguish between knowing the path and walking it. This journey through solitude, through self-denial, through silence, was the crucible in which Al-Ghazali was reshaped. Not by external forces, but by relentless inner confrontation. He did not find answers by retreating from the world. He found the strength to return to it with truth not borrowed, but earned. His seclusion was not a flight from responsibility. It was the preparation to carry it with integrity. What he would later teach came not from theory, but from fire. After nearly a decade of internal reconstruction, Al-Ghazali emerged with a mind sharpened by solitude and a soul grounded in sincerity. He had confronted his doubts, purified his intentions, and realigned his pursuit of truth. What followed was not silence, but a powerful intellectual response, one that would shake the foundations of the philosophical establishment across the Islamic world. The target was clear: the growing dominance of Greek-inspired rationalist philosophy and its claim to ultimate truth through pure reason. Al-Ghazali did not reject philosophy out of ignorance. He had mastered it. He knew the structure of its arguments, the hierarchy of its premises, and the seductive elegance of its conclusions. He had once admired its clarity. Now he saw its limits. The core issue was not the utility of logic in daily matters, but its inability to reach beyond the veil of the unseen. Rationalist philosophers claimed that human intellect alone could access metaphysical truths. To Al-Ghazali, this was not only false, it was dangerous. His answer came in the form of a landmark work, Tahafut al-Falasifa, or The Incoherence of the Philosophers. In it, he dismantled 20 key doctrines advanced by the likes of Avicenna and Al-Farabi. But this was not an attack rooted in dogma. It was a critique delivered with precision, logic, and restraint. He met the philosophers on their own turf, using the tools of reason to expose reason's own inadequacies. He acknowledged the value of logic in empirical or natural matters, but he drew a red line when it came to theology and metaphysics. Human intellect, he argued, has a boundary. Beyond it lies the realm of divine truth, which can be known only through revelation and inner purification, not speculation. Among the 20 points he addressed, 3 were especially severe. First, the belief that the universe had no beginning. Second, the denial of bodily resurrection. Third, the assertion that God knows only universals, not particulars. On these issues, Al-Ghazali declared the philosophers not merely mistaken, but outside the fold of Islam. These weren't academic disagreements. These were breaches in the core of Islamic belief. The philosophers, in attempting to elevate reason above all else, had undermined essential tenets of faith. What made Al-Ghazali's argument so impactful was not just its content, but its method. He did not dismiss philosophy wholesale. He distinguished between its branches. Mathematics, logic, astronomy, and physics were valuable tools when used within proper bounds. His concern was not with science, but with overreach. He saw the danger in using philosophical certainty to interpret religious truth, which, by its nature, transcends empirical verification. This distinction would later protect many branches of learning from being discarded, while still restoring faith to its rightful primacy. His work sent shockwaves through the intellectual landscape. For decades, rationalist philosophy had seemed untouchable, its sophistication admired, its coherence celebrated. But Al-Ghazali revealed the hidden assumptions beneath its surface. He showed that coherence does not equal truth, and that a flawless argument may still rest on flawed foundations. By naming and dissecting these foundations, he exposed the illusion of self-sufficiency in human intellect. Yet he offered no alternative that discarded thinking. He did not retreat into anti-intellectualism. Instead, he redirected inquiry toward humility. He reminded scholars that knowledge must begin with recognition of one's own limits. Certainty in matters of the unseen cannot come through deduction alone. It requires inner illumination, ethical living, and spiritual discipline. Philosophy had offered structure. He brought it conscience. The response from the philosophical community was swift. Decades later, Averroes would write Tahafut al-Tahafut, * the incoherence of the incoherence *, to refute Al-Ghazali's claims. But the influence of Al-Ghazali had already reshaped the trajectory of Islamic thought. He had forced a re-evaluation of assumptions, compelled a return to revelation as the ultimate source of certainty, and reopened the gates of theology to spiritual meaning rather than abstraction. His critique also transcended Islam. Western thinkers, directly or indirectly, felt the tremors of his ideas. His skepticism of unaided reason anticipated themes that would later appear in the works of Descartes and Hume. Al-Ghazali raised questions that would echo across centuries. What can we know? How do we know it? What is the role of experience in accessing truth? But Al-Ghazali was not seeking fame or victory in debate. His aim was restoration. He wanted to restore balance between reason and revelation, intellect and heart, method and meaning. He had seen firsthand what happens when scholarship loses its soul, when learning becomes an end in itself rather than a path to the divine. His intervention was not the destruction of philosophy, but its ethical reorientation. With the incoherence of the philosophers, Al-Ghazali did more than critique a worldview. He altered the terms of discourse. No longer could philosophers assume that reason alone held the keys to truth. No longer could theology be reduced to logic games. The heart had reclaimed its place in the pursuit of knowledge. Al-Ghazali had not just challenged an intellectual movement, he had redefined what it meant to know. Al-Ghazali returned not to reclaim authority, but to fulfill a responsibility he could no longer ignore. His years in seclusion had given him clarity, and that clarity demanded expression. He resumed teaching, but on his own terms, away from court patronage and public flattery. His mission had changed. He was no longer concerned with preserving intellectual dominance. He was now concerned with reviving the heart of the faith. That revival would take form in the most ambitious work of his life, Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences. This book was not a collection of theoretical musings. It was a reconstruction of Islamic life, organized not around abstract theology, but around lived sincerity. He divided the work into 4 major quarters, each addressing a critical dimension of the faith: acts of worship, social norms, destructive traits, and saving virtues. But what distinguished this work was not its structure. It was its aim: to unify the legal, ethical, spiritual, and psychological dimensions of Islam in a single integrated path. In the first quarter, Al-Ghazali re-examined acts of worship. He did not merely describe how to pray, fast, or give charity. He exposed the inner meanings behind each action. Prayer without presence, fasting without humility, pilgrimage without transformation, these, he warned, were empty shells. He connected external rituals to internal states, showing how every act of worship was a tool for purifying the soul. His goal was to move beyond mechanics and awaken purpose. The second quarter focused on customs and social behavior. Here, he detailed how Islam governs not only spiritual acts, but everyday interactions. He wrote about eating, sleeping, marriage, work, and friendship, not to enforce control, but to show that every moment could be sanctified. His treatment of these topics was not moralistic. It was holistic. By framing ordinary life as a series of opportunities to grow in character, he made faith a constant practice rather than a periodic duty. In the third quarter, he turned to the destructive qualities of the soul. He addressed arrogance, envy, greed, vanity, and insincerity. Unlike earlier scholars who treated these as moral flaws, Al-Ghazali approached them as spiritual diseases. He analyzed their roots, traced their manifestations, and prescribed specific treatments. His method was diagnostic. He believed that self-awareness was the first step toward purification. His language was direct, not rhetorical. He confronted readers with the mirror of their own hearts, and urged them to act before hypocrisy calcified into ruin. The final quarter explored the qualities that lead to salvation. He emphasized sincerity, patience, gratitude, reliance on God, fear and hope, repentance, and love. These were not emotions to be admired from afar. They were spiritual disciplines to be cultivated through action and reflection. Al-Ghazali made clear that true success was not external achievement but internal awakening. He reminded readers that the ultimate aim was not social approval or scholarly fame, but nearness to God. What made Ihya extraordinary was its integration. Legal scholars had addressed outward behavior. Mystics had emphasized inner experience. Philosophers had explored rational coherence. Al-Ghazali brought them together, insisting that true religion involved all three. He saw no contradiction between intellect and devotion, between law and love. He viewed them as interdependent parts of a healthy soul. His synthesis was not theoretical. It was forged through his own spiritual journey, which gave him the authority to speak with depth and precision. He filled the book with references to Quranic verses, prophetic traditions, statements from early Muslims, and psychological insight. But he used these not to impress. He used them to awaken. His concern was not knowledge for its own sake, but transformation. He challenged readers to look within, to examine their intentions, to purify their actions. For him, the revival of Islam would not come through political reform or intellectual debate. It would come through the resurrection of sincerity. The reception of the Ihya was immediate and widespread. It became a foundational text, studied in mosques, homes, and schools. It influenced generations of scholars, jurists, and spiritual teachers. It shaped the ethical vocabulary of the Muslim world for centuries. Its power lay in its balance, equally rigorous and accessible, equally intellectual and practical. Yet Al-Ghazali remained detached from its popularity. He had no interest in legacy. His goal was not to be remembered, but to restore something essential that had been forgotten. The Ihya was his offering to a community drifting between legalism and neglect, between abstract theology and spiritual complacency. It was his answer to a question that had once consumed him: how can one live a life of knowledge that leads to God? He had no need to invent new doctrines. His achievement was to recenter what already existed around sincerity. In doing so, he brought the religion back to its essence: worship with meaning, ethics with soul, knowledge with humility. Through Ihya Ulum Al-Ghazali reminded his readers that revival does not begin with institutions or systems. It begins with the individual, purified in intention and rooted in truth. In his final years, Al-Ghazali lived far from the public gaze, teaching a small group of students in his hometown of Tus. He had no interest in fame, position, or authority. The man who once held the most prestigious post in the Islamic world now devoted himself to simplicity and solitude. He taught quietly, wrote steadily, and lived according to the same principles he had long urged others to follow. His life had come full circle, not back to public acclaim, but to private clarity. His death was quiet. There were no elaborate eulogies or ceremonies. But what he left behind did not remain confined to the margins. His influence had already taken root across disciplines and continents. The transformation he underwent had created a model for others, not only scholars and theologians, but anyone seeking meaning in a world of distraction. He had shown that the path to truth is neither purely external nor entirely internal, but a disciplined integration of both. His work redefined how knowledge was understood. He placed intention above appearance, inner clarity above public recognition. By doing so, he permanently changed the relationship between scholarship and spirituality. Before him, intellectual achievement was often detached from self-examination. After him, sincerity became the litmus test of religious authenticity. He held that the soul, not the tongue, determines the worth of words. That idea reshaped Islamic ethics and set a new standard for religious authority. In the centuries that followed, Al-Ghazali's writings were studied in every major Islamic institution. His synthesis of jurisprudence, theology, and spirituality provided a framework for balanced religious life. Sufis found in him a champion of the inner path. Jurists saw a scholar grounded in legal tradition. Theologians respected his command over logic and dialectic. His legacy was not confined to any single group. He transcended categories because he refused to be confined by them. What distinguished him most was not his intellect, but his moral clarity. He understood that knowledge, without humility, leads to arrogance. That worship, without sincerity, becomes ritualism. That action, without reflection, becomes hollow. He urged constant self-audit, scrutiny not of others, but of one's own heart. For him, the greatest threat to religion was not opposition from outside, but corruption within. His solution was not harshness or retreat, but a relentless return to core principles, intention, sincerity, and accountability. His vision proved durable. During times of political collapse, sectarian division, and cultural confusion, his voice remained a guide. He addressed not only the scholar but the common believer. His teachings did not rely on complexity. They relied on honesty. He taught that truth, once found, must reshape the entire self. It cannot remain an idea. It must become character. Even outside the Islamic world, echoes of his thought reached philosophers and theologians. His skepticism toward unchecked rationalism resonated with later Western thinkers. His insistence on moral foundations anticipated later movements that critiqued sterile intellectualism. He demonstrated that doubt, when properly faced, could lead to deeper faith, not to its erosion. That message crossed boundaries because it addressed something universally human, the search for meaning that both satisfies the mind and nourishes the heart. Al-Ghazali's life was not a linear ascent. It was marked by crisis, breakdown, retreat, and reconstruction. But it is precisely that journey that made his insights credible. He did not speak from detachment. He spoke from experience. Every page he wrote bore the imprint of struggle overcome. His authority came not from title, but from transformation. What endures is not just his arguments, but his example. In an age of appearances, he pursued substance. In a culture of competition, he chose humility. In a system that rewarded status, he walked away. His legacy is not one of dominance, but of restoration. He did not aim to win debates. He aimed to realign the soul with its purpose. For Al-Ghazali, the mind was never the enemy. It was a necessary tool. But it could not lead the journey alone. The heart, refined by sincerity and guided by revelation, had to take the lead. Knowledge was a path, not a destination. And that path required constant vigilance against the self's tendency to seek praise, power, and ease. His life was proof that inner reform is not theoretical. It is demanding, personal, and essential. In the end, he did not offer a new system. He returned to the essence of the faith and gave it clarity. His writings became lanterns in uncertain times, not because they dazzled with novelty, but because they reminded people of what had been forgotten. He revived not doctrines, but consciousness. Al-Ghazali died with no worldly project unfinished, no public ambition unfulfilled. He had built nothing material, but had reconstructed the architecture of thought and conscience. His work continues not in institutions, but in hearts that seek to be sincere. He left no empire behind, but he restored the balance between intellect and spirit. And in doing so, he healed not just his own heart, but the heart of a tradition.